Hey everybody, Mr. Rogers here, back with the second video in our series on fighting World War I. The first video we looked at the early part of the war, which saw German initial success, but eventually a stalemate that happened on what was called the Western Front. Then we expanded our look to take a look at what was it like to be a soldier in World War I. How was the war experienced by the people who actually fought it on the front lines? And then we looked specifically at two important battles, the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of Somme. The latter we're going to look at in one of our checkpoints in this class, so you want to make sure you pay particular attention to what we talked about here in that video. Today, in this video, what we're going to look at is what was it like on a cultural level to fight the war? What was it like on the home front? What was it like in parts of the world that weren't necessarily in Europe? And then we'll look at how the war ended and its impact. Okay? And we're going to start right here, right now, with talking about how World War I was an example of total war. All the societies involved were completely mobilized to win the war. There was no holding back. This was a huge popular mobilization of these societies. People of all social classes served in the military. So if you go back to my lectures about the early 19th, early 20th century culture, society, we said that there were three classes: the capitalists, the middle class, and working class people. All people across those classes were serving in this war. It was not just a rich person's war. It was not just a middle class person's war. It was not just a poor person's war. All people throughout society were serving, and men throughout society were serving, and women as well. And we'll talk more about women in a minute. Again, because thousands of people are dying per battle, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands were dying per battle. And because of that, you couldn't just be poor people fighting. Rich people and middle-class people had to fight too. There was such a demand for soldiers because of such high casualty rates. All right, women were drawn into service. I'm going to talk more about that actually in the next slide, about what women were involved in. But women were serving, again, in multiple levels, both on the front, primarily as nurses, but in other roles. And they were also doing important tasks back home. And in imperial countries, men throughout the empire were often drawn into service, often far from home. So that means that if you were part of, say, the British Empire, you were a Kenyan, a Jamaican, a Canadian, an Indian, a South African, you would have to serve in your colonial master, that's the British, army, and fight for them, which we'll get to. Does not make people very happy. And then, of course, civilians were targeted by both sides in fighting. Just because you were a French person sitting, chilling on your vineyard, growing wine, does not mean that you would not get bombed or killed by the Germans. And just because you were a German dude sitting in your town, writing your newspaper, doesn't mean that you would not get bombed by the Allies trying to damage the morale, damage the willingness of the Germans, of the French, of the British to fight the war. The goal here is for all of society to fight the war, which means that you can target all of the society on the opposing side. So that's what a total war is. All of the societies involved were completely mobilized to win the war. There was no holding back. Specifically, what did that mean for women? Well, women were mobilized at a scale never before seen in the industrial world of these countries like Germany, France, Britain, Austria. All right. Women, of course, served in many capacities, most famously and most prominently as nurses, both on the front lines as battlefield nurses in the trenches alongside men and in field hospitals, but also back home in hospitals that were serving veterans, in recovery places for veterans who were recovering from their injuries. So you have women serving as nurses, but you also had women serving as in industrial work, making weapons, making tanks, making the necessities to keep society running, even though most men were running around fighting directly in the war. Women were back home making the weapons that allowed them to fight. In fact, one observer in Britain said in 1916 that there were no men everywhere. Women were doing everything. Because again, think about this. This is a war where in minutes, thousands of people could be killed. Battles were leading to hundreds of thousands of people dying. So they could no longer, these armies could not be just sustained by those who wanted to fight. They had to be by people who weren't willing to fight, who had to be drafted into fighting. And just because you say were at home as a man making tanks, if every other man in your town died, you and your coworkers, you got to get your ass off to the front and fight. That means that women need to go and start making tanks, start making weapons, start preparing food to keep society running. And because of this expanded role during the war, women's place in societies in Western and Central Europe changed fundamentally. Women were now more successful in making demands for rights and political participation that they've been making for, centuries, but more specifically, for at least the last 100, 150 years, there have been a concerted effort for more rights for women, called feminism, but they start having real widespread success in these Central and Western European countries after the war, thanks to women's widespread involvement in the war effort. So if women are able to make your guns, serve as your nurses, save the lives of veterans, build the guns that fought the Germans, fought the British, whatever, then you have the right to participate and vote. If women can serve alongside the men in their lives, then they also, and be active participants in the war, then they should be active citizens after the war. And not just rely on their fathers, husbands, sons for their political participation. And that means that after the war, women in Britain, Germany, and France would get the vote for the first time. What did it mean to be a person in a colonial country? That means a country that was imperialized by one of these European powers. Well, colonized people throughout the world were called upon to serve in imperial armies. So that means, again, if you're a Kenyan, you would be called to serve with the British Army. If you were Canadian, British Army, Indian, British Army. I'm escaping other European countries' colonies right now. But, Vietnamese, French, there we go. I got one there. All right, so the problem, of course, for colonial people was that their regiments, colonial regiments, faced higher casualty rates. So if you were serving in a Kenyan regiment, you were much more likely to die than if you were in an English or Scottish regiment. Okay? And this war was also fought in your home. It wasn't just fought in Europe, it was also fought in Africa and in Asia. So, if you were a Kenyan called to serve by your British overlords, you could be fighting at home, or your ass could be sent to France to fight. It was entirely up to the needs of those imperial countries. So you had little say in defending your home or going to defend a British person's home. And when you did serve, you faced higher casualty rates than other groups. And all of this taken together, service in the war helped further resentment of these imperial countries throughout the colonized world. Again, Kenyans, Jamaicans, Indians, South Asians, they did not appreciate this quite clearly. They were frequently called to serve in places that were far away from their home, to die for a cause that had very little impact on their actual lives and their actual day-to-day experiences and on the interests of their own countries and their own people. Or they had to defend their home from attack. They had no beef with the Germans if you were in a British colony or a French colony, but you've got the Germans attacking your home for nothing that you and your people did because of something some person in London or some person in Paris or some person in Berlin did. So this is going to further the resentment of these imperialized countries in Africa and Asia in particular. And this resentment is going to power colonial nationalism. So that nationalism that we talked about, again, in that late 19th, early 20th century lecture that I gave, that's going to just take off again after World War I. And we'll see later where that goes in future projects, particularly if you take my unit on imperialism. All right. Now, morale remained high throughout the war on both sides. And morale is the willingness of society to fight, to keep fighting the war, to watch their friends, family, or themselves die in this war. And this was achieved through nationalist appeals and propaganda. Now, propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. So again, these were lies, basically, that were told to the people to keep them willing to fight the war, willing to watch their friends and family die in the war, willing to see their whole societies disrupted by this giant war. Now, dissenters, which was people who disagreed with the war, they were frequently suppressed. They were jailed. They were excluded. The society was told that they're the enemies. And we can see that in this picture over here on the right, which is a British propaganda picture, which is saying the conscientious objectors right here, that's somebody whose conscience, their spiritual beliefs, their philosophical beliefs say that they can't serve in the military, can't serve in the war. You see this with Jehovah's Witnesses today in our country. That's just one example of many other people, or Quakers, to be very Philadelphian. They object to war, so they're not going to serve. They're not going to serve in the military. Well, this ad is saying that they're basically fighting for the Germans by not being willing to fight in the war. And we, of course, see some more examples of propaganda in the next slide. All right, on the left is a very racist British example propaganda showing the Germans as guerrillas, like stealing away this half-naked lady, got a bloody club. And then on the right, we see a more positive, you can't see my scare quotes, depiction of a cool-looking German soldier that's saying that you should fight and die for your father country. Be cool like this dude. Be willing to fight and die for your country. All right, so we've got the sort of racism on the left, the nationalism on the right. All right, now, the West was not the only part of Europe involved in the fighting. The Eastern Front, which was mostly Russia, but also Serbia, was primarily a battle between Austria-Hungary and Germany against Serbia and Russia. And if you want to learn more about Serbia, be sure to check out my lecture series on the origins of World War I, because Serbia was really important for that. Now, initially, Russia was very successful. You can see this line right here, which shows how far they came pretty close to Berlin. Pretty close to Berlin, all things considered. Initially, Russia was very successful, particularly against Austria-Hungary. All right. However, when things out in the West got stalemated and Germany's plans there didn't work out, Germany actually changed the logic of their plans. Originally, as I talked about in part 1, their goal was to knock out the French so that they could fight the Russians. Well, now they flipped that on its head. Their plan now was they would knock out the Russians so they could focus on fighting the French and the British. All right? And Germans believed that if they didn't do anything about fighting Russia, Russia would overwhelm their ally Austria-Hungary and things would be done for Germany. So in May 1915, Germany launches a major and successful invasion of Russia, where the Russians are pushed all the way back here. And by 1915, the Central Powers, by the end of 1915, the Central Powers had also conquered Serbia. And Russia never recovered from its massive defeat. Over 1 million Russian soldiers were killed, and another million were captured by the Central Powers. Defeat massively stabilized Russia, which was having its own problems before then, all right, which are too big for us to get into here. All right, they had huge food shortages and caused massive unrest. Defeat on the battlefield and a lack of food at home caused the Russian government to collapse. Now, again, I'm massively simplifying a super complicated problem and situation in Russia. But what happens is once the Russian government collapses, in its place arises the first communist government in world history, the Soviet Union. And we'll be learning about the Soviet Union in future projects. It's not really inside the scope of this class too much, but it's got a very important, very interesting history of its own. What the Soviet Union does is they negotiate in 1917 for a ceasefire, and in March 1918, the Soviet Union makes a separate peace from France, separate peace from Britain, who are supposed to be their allies, but they're not at that point, to end Russian/Soviet involvement in World War I. Because the Soviet Union's got its own problems internal to itself. It doesn't want to deal with this war. So they make their own peace in 1918. All right? So this Eastern Front comes to an end, and the Germans are now able to turn their attentions back to primarily fighting in the West. So again, Eastern Front is initially hugely successful for Russia, but the Germans end up kicking the Russian asses, which leads to Russia collapsing and the Soviet Union arising in its place and leading to about 100 years of Soviet dominance of Eastern Europe, which is a long story of its own history that we'll learn about in future projects. All right, how did the war end? Well, there were two factors that led to the end of the war. The first was American intervention, the United States, whoop, whoop, and the second was German exhaustion. Let's talk first about the United States. All right, initially the United States is neutral in World War I. President Woodrow Wilson was reelected in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." You can see this button here that says War in Europe, Peace in America, God bless Wilson. So again, Woodrow Wilson ran on a peace platform. Popular and cultural sympathy in the United States was primarily with the Allies. However, there were some people who supported the Central Powers, but most, particularly elite Americans, those in government, the presidents, the senators, the Congress people, the people who were serving in government, really were sympathetic with the British. American banks loaned money to both sides, but it mostly favored the Allies, which is going to give rich people in America an interest in, the Allies winning. And of course, now there's this naval war going on between Germany and Britain that has a strong chance of involving the United States. So British ships and German ships are firing at each other, sinking each other, and there's a chance that that could end up involving the United States. Because as a neutral country, the United States expected to be able to trade with both sides, and for American citizens to be left alone by both sides. So that's basically saying this is what the American position was, that any American citizen or American boat could go into a war zone, and neither side, the Germans or the British, could fire upon them, kill an American, or anything like that. This American position, their ability to say, look, we should be able to trade with the Germans, we should be able to trade with the French, with the British, with the Austrians, and you can't do anything to us because we're neutral. This is going to create a whole chance for some shenanigans, and is how the United States gets involved in the war. Because this neutrality cannot be maintained with America getting in people's business. In February 1917, Germany announced it would attack any ship in the war zone, including American ships. This was known as unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans hoped that it would knock out the British, but it did risk American involvement. Because again, let's go back. America said that they had the right to trade with both sides. But the Germans' willingness to fire on anyone who is in nearby Britain means that they will fire on Americans too. To add insult to injury to the United States, in January 1917, American spies intercepted what is known as the Zimmermann telegram. In this telegram, the Germans promised to return the southwest of the United States to Mexico if the Mexican army invaded the United States. Now, whether or not the Zimmermann telegram actually existed is a really controversial thing these days. Some historians believe that the British faked it to get Americans upset at the Germans and try to get more Americans on the German side. And if that's what they did, they were very successful, because the Zimmermann telegram and this unrestricted submarine warfare pushed American opinion towards war. And on April 6th, 1917, the United States ends up declaring war on Germany because of the destruction of American ships, thanks to this unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. And they join the Allied side. So they're now not just at war with Germany, they're at war with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. And President Wilson promises a war to make the world safe for democracy, and that this would be the war to end all wars. And as we know, that didn't work out. All right. This leads to a German offensive, all right? Because at the beginning of 1918, things looked bleak for the Allies. Allied offensives have been a disaster. We already talked about the Battle of the Somme. More were dead and little was gained. Russia was now out of the war, and more German soldiers were coming to the west from the east. So Germany no longer has to worry about Russia, so it can bring all those soldiers to the west. Believing they could win the war, Germany launched a new offensive in 1918. On March 21st, 1918, Germany launched an attack, again, in the Second Battle of the Somme. While this was initially successful, it proved too little too late, because Allied forces were replenished by American troops. By the summer of 1918, the offensive was stopped, and the failure smashed German morale. All right. So, Germany sees an opportunity to attack the Allies thanks to defeating Russia, thanks to the peace treaty they made with Russia, thanks to the fact that the Allies' attacks on Germany had been a giant disaster. Well, it ends up being a giant disaster for Germany when they attack back, because while they were initially successful, the Americans come into the war and replenish the Allied forces with new troops. And so by the summer of 1918, the offensive was stopped, and the Allies counterattack in July 1918 in response. And by the fall of 1918, Germany had lost all the ground it had gained that year, and it was clear by the fall of 1918 that the Allies would be able to eventually win the war thanks to the influx of new American soldiers. The failures of 1918 destroyed German morale very rapidly. Protests broke out throughout Germany. There was shortage of food, water, and electricity. And in November of 1918, the Central Powers collapsed. Austria-Hungary withdrew from the war on November 3rd. Germany requested an armistice, which was the end of the fighting, on November 7th. On November 9th, the German emperor was forced to abdicate, which means give up his throne, and a German republic was created. On November 11th, an armistice, that means the end of the fighting, was signed between Germany and the Allied powers. And that leads us to war casualties. So, let's look at this real quick as the last thing that we really look at for this slideshow. For Austria-Hungary, they mobilized 7.8 million men. 7 million died. 7 million. That means 90% of the men that they mobilized to fight in the war died. In Russia, mobilized 12 million. That means at 9.15 million died, which means they had a casualty rate of 76%. France mobilized 8.4 million, and 6 million died, which is a casualty rate of 71%. Britain, we'll do Germany first. Germany mobilized 11 million, and 7 million died, which is a casualty rate of 63%. 63% of their soldiers died. The lowest is Britain, which mobilized 8.9 million people, and 3 million died, which is only a 34% death rate, but still 3 million people died. Okay? This shows us overall that this war was a massive loss of life, a gigantic, traumatic experience that is going to utterly reshape European culture to its core. And that's what we'll be exploring in future checkpoints after we get through what it was like to be a soldier with our examination of the Battle of the Somme. So please make sure you check your study questions against this video and against the PowerPoint slide. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, until then, stay safe and stay healthy.